When someone accuses you, criticizes you, or questions you in a way that feels unfair, the instinct to defend yourself rises almost automatically. You don't even have to think about it. Your body reacts before your mind does. Your chest tightens, your thoughts speed up, and suddenly you feel this internal pressure to explain, to correct, to justify, to make sure the other person understands the truth. That instinct feels reasonable because most of us were raised to believe that being misunderstood is dangerous and that silence means guilt. We were taught that if someone says something wrong about us, the responsible thing is to clear it up immediately. Defending yourself feels like self-respect. It feels like standing up for who you are. But the part most people never realize is that defense does not function the way we think it does. Defending yourself doesn't restore balance. It quietly shifts power away from you in ways that are subtle but deeply impactful. The moment you begin defending yourself, you're no longer speaking from confidence. You're speaking from pressure. And pressure always gives the other person leverage. What you're really doing, without realizing it, is telling them that their words were heavy enough to knock you off center. You're telling them that they get to test your worth, that they get to question your character, and that you're willing to step forward to prove yourself in response. That's not strength. That's positioning yourself as someone who needs external validation to feel steady again. Think about it this way. The instant you defend yourself, you're walking into an invisible courtroom. The other person didn't announce it, but they set it up the moment they accused you. You walk in, look around, and without asking any questions, you sit in the defendant's chair. You hand the other person the role of judge without them earning it. You give them the authority to decide whether your explanation is sufficient, whether your reason is acceptable, whether your intentions are pure enough. Once you see it this way, it becomes obvious how dangerous defense really is. Because no matter how clearly you explain yourself, no matter how logical or honest you are, you're still playing a game where the outcome is never in your control. That's the part people miss. They believe the quality of their explanation will save them. They think if they find the right words, the other person will finally understand, soften, apologize, or admit they were wrong. But that rarely happens, especially with people who accuse unfairly. Those people aren't looking for clarity. They're looking for control, reassurance, or emotional dominance. And defense feeds all three. When you defend, you lower yourself into a reactive position. You begin responding instead of choosing. You're no longer guiding the conversation, you're being dragged by it. And the more emotionally charged the accusation is, the faster that loss of control happens. Your tone tightens. Your sentences get longer. You start stacking reasons on top of reasons. And with every word, you sink deeper into their frame. Clarification, on the other hand, feels very different. Clarification is calm, it's minimal. It doesn't hurry. Clarification doesn't try to win. It simply adds context where context is genuinely needed. It doesn't come from a place of fear that silence will condemn you. It comes from knowing that your value doesn't fluctuate based on someone else's misunderstanding. Defense sounds like scrambling. Clarification sounds like steadiness. Defense carries urgency. Clarification carries patience. Defense is emotional. Clarification is grounded. And the reason this distinction matters so much is because people don't evaluate strength based on logic. They evaluate it based on presence. They don't just hear what you say. They feel where it's coming from. The moment you defend yourself, your body betrays you. Even if your words sound reasonable, your nervous system is activated, your face tightens, your breathing changes, your posture shifts, and subconsciously, the other person senses that you're under pressure. That perception alone weakens your position more than any accusation ever could. Most conflicts don't stay alive because of the original accusation. They stay alive because defense keeps feeding them. Every time you counter an accusation with explanations, you're affirming its importance. You're saying, "This deserves my energy." And once something has your energy, it gains weight. It gains presence. It gains influence. Think about how arguments actually play out. Someone says something unfair, you defend. They respond by poking holes. You defend harder. They escalate. Suddenly, you're not even arguing about the original issue anymore. You're arguing about tone, memory, intentions, or past events. The conversation balloons because defense expands conflict. It never shrinks it. And here's something that's uncomfortable but true. Defending yourself often comes from insecurity, even if you don't consciously identify it that way. Not insecurity in the sense of low self-worth, but insecurity and stability. A secure person doesn't feel the need to correct every assumption, disprove every accusation, or chase every misunderstanding. They allow room for other people's opinions to exist without letting those opinions define them. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from self-trust. Look at people who naturally command respect. Leaders, calm communicators, emotionally regulated individuals, they don't rush to explain themselves. They pause. They choose. They speak less, not more. Their silence isn't defensive. It's deliberate. And because it's deliberate, it carries weight. Defense also has a long-term cost that most people don't recognize in the moment. When you defend yourself repeatedly around certain people, you are teaching them how to interact with you. You are conditioning them to believe that accusations earn attention, explanations and engagement. You're showing them exactly which buttons get a response. Over time, those people will use that knowledge consciously or unconsciously. They'll push when they want reassurance. They'll accuse when they want control. And every time you defend, you reinforce that pattern. That's why defending feels good short term but damages you long term. In the moment, it feels like relief. You get to express yourself. You get to release tension. But afterward, you often feel worse, drained, frustrated, resentful. Not because you said the wrong thing, but because you stepped into a role you didn't belong in. You surrendered power you didn't need to give away. The strongest communicators understand one simple truth. Their value is not on trial. Their character doesn't need approval. Their truth doesn't require permission. And because they know this, they don't rush to defend when challenged. They let accusations sit without immediately answering them. They allow silence, they ask questions, they slow things down. And in doing so, they reshape the entire interaction. Every conversation operates inside a frame. A frame is the invisible structure that determines who leads, who follows, what matters, and what doesn't. The person who sets the frame controls the direction of the interaction. Most people don't realize a frame exists, which is why they lose control so easily. They assume conversations are about exchanging information, but they're really about positioning. When someone accuses you, the frame is this: you are wrong, and you need to prove otherwise. The moment you defend, you accept that frame. You don't challenge it, you don't question it, you simply step into it. And once you do, the conversation is no longer neutral, it's tilted. Controlling the frame doesn't mean dominating the other person. It means refusing to play a role you didn't agree to. It means recognizing when someone is trying to place you beneath them and calmly stepping back into equality. It means understanding that not every accusation deserves engagement and not every question deserves an answer. If someone calls you selfish and you immediately explain why you're not, you've accepted their authority to define you. If instead you respond with something calm and neutral like, "That's an interesting perspective," you've shifted the frame. You're no longer on trial. You're standing beside them, not beneath them. That shift may seem small, but it completely changes the energy of the exchange. This shows up constantly at work, in relationships, and in everyday interactions. When someone says, "You're not working hard enough," and you rush to list your accomplishments, you accept their frame of inadequacy. But when you ask, "What does hard enough look like to you?" you move the responsibility back to them. You're no longer proving, you're clarifying, and clarification preserves power. Frames only work when both people agree to them. The moment you refuse to step inside, the other person feels it. They may push harder, they may repeat themselves, they may escalate. But eventually, without your cooperation, the frame collapses. And when that happens, the conversation either shifts into something healthier or ends altogether. Acknowledgement is another tool that protects your power. Most people confuse acknowledgement with agreement, so they avoid it. But acknowledgement simply means recognizing that someone has spoken. It doesn't mean validating their accusation or accepting their judgment. It means you heard them. Nothing more. When someone says, "You don't care about me," defending sounds like listing proof. Acknowledgement sounds like, "I hear that's how you feel." That sentence doesn't weaken you. It strengthens you. It shows emotional maturity. It shows presence. And it disarms conflict because you're not feeding it. People often escalate because they want reaction. When they don't get it, the fire loses oxygen. That's why acknowledgement works so well. It meets emotion without meeting aggression. It offers recognition without surrender. Questions are another powerful way to stay out of defense. Answers pull you into someone else's frame. Questions push responsibility back to them. When someone says, "Why are you always so difficult?" answering traps you. Asking rebalances the conversation. It forces clarity. It slows things down, and it protects your nervous system. Calm questions signal confidence. Insecurity rushes to explain. Confidence takes its time. Confidence doesn't feel urgency to correct every assumption. It understands that clarity emerges when pressure is removed. And finally, groundedness is what ties everything together. Reacting gives people control. Staying grounded takes it back. Groundedness isn't silence out of fear. It's silence out of choice. It's breath before words. It's control over your internal state regardless of external pressure. When you stay grounded, you become difficult to manipulate. Drama doesn't pull you. Accusations don't shake you. Provocation doesn't steer you. And that steadiness changes how people treat you over time. Got it? Continuing seamlessly. Same tone, same flow, no headings, no breaks. As you stay grounded in moments where others expect you to react, something subtle but powerful begins to happen inside you. You start to notice the space between stimulus and response. That space is where self-control lives. Most people never touch it because they move too fast. They react before awareness kicks in. But once you slow down enough to feel that space, you realize that no one can actually force a reaction out of you. They can provoke, accuse, or misunderstand, but the response still belongs to you. That realization alone changes how you move through conversations. Groundedness isn't about winning arguments. It's about refusing to lose yourself inside them. When someone throws emotional weight at you and you remain centered, you send a message without saying a word. You communicate that you are not easily shaken, that your sense of self is stable, and that you don't collapse under pressure. People read that instantly. Energy always speaks louder than language. Someone can accuse you loudly, passionately, even aggressively, but if you remain steady, the contrast exposes the imbalance in the interaction. Calm presence has a way of revealing chaos without having to point it out. One of the most misunderstood ideas in communication is the belief that silence is weakness. We're conditioned to think that if we don't respond immediately, we're losing. In reality, silence is often the strongest response available. Silence doesn't mean acceptance. It doesn't mean agreement. It means you are choosing not to fill the air with unnecessary words. It means you're giving yourself time to assess whether this moment deserves your energy at all. And that choice alone keeps you from being pulled into games you never intended to play. Most emotional traps rely on speed. Accusations are thrown quickly because the other person wants to catch you before you're fully aware. They want an instinctive response. They want defensiveness. They want emotion. Silence disrupts that process. It removes momentum. It forces the other person to sit with their own words. Many times people reveal their intentions simply by how uncomfortable they become when you don't react. They may repeat themselves. They may escalate. They may soften. Each reaction tells you something, but none of them require you to defend yourself. Over time, when you stop reacting, you'll notice something interesting. People begin to adjust the way they speak to you. Those who relied on provoking you lose their leverage. They no longer get the emotional payoff they expect. Others, the ones who actually want healthy communication, begin to engage with more respect. They slow down. They choose their words more carefully. Groundedness teaches people how to treat you without you having to announce boundaries out loud. This shift doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without discomfort. The first few times you don't defend yourself, your nervous system will protest. You'll feel exposed. You'll feel like you're letting something slide. You'll worry that you look weak or guilty. That's conditioning speaking, not truth. You're undoing years of being trained to equate self-worth with explanation. That discomfort fades as your confidence catches up to your behavior. Another layer of this work is learning to tolerate being misunderstood. This is one of the hardest things for people, especially those who care deeply about integrity and fairness. Being misunderstood can feel unbearable. It can feel like a threat to your identity. But the truth is, being misunderstood temporarily is far less damaging than over-explaining yourself habitually. Over-explanation trains people to question you. Calm acceptance of misunderstanding trains you to trust yourself. You don't need to correct every false assumption in real time. Some misunderstandings resolve on their own as behavior continues to speak. Others don't matter enough to correct. And the ones that do matter can be addressed without urgency, without pressure, and without stepping into defense. When you stop trying to control how you're perceived in every moment, you regain control over how you experience yourself. There is also a deep emotional maturity in recognizing that not everyone is entitled to your inner world. Defending yourself often means opening doors that don't need to be opened. You explain your intentions. You reveal your thought process. You expose vulnerability to people who may not handle it with care. Grounded communication protects you from oversharing with the wrong audience. It allows discernment. You get to decide who deserves access to your reasons and who doesn't. Another reason defending feels so automatic is because we're afraid of judgment. Judgment feels final. It feels like a verdict. But judgment only has power if you accept it as truth. When you don't, it becomes just another opinion floating in the air. Strong communicators understand this at a deep level. They know that being judged doesn't equal being condemned. And they know that dignity isn't maintained by explaining, but by standing still. This doesn't mean you avoid accountability. Accountability is different from defensiveness. Accountability is proactive. It comes from ownership, not pressure. If you've made a mistake, you don't need to defend. You can acknowledge it. Ownership dissolves defensiveness because there is nothing left to prove. You're not arguing reality, you're engaging it directly. Defense, by contrast, often shows up when there's nothing to take ownership of but pressure still exists. People who rely on accusing others often struggle when they're met with calm accountability or grounded neutrality. They don't know where to land. Without your emotional reaction, they're left holding their own assumptions. And that can be uncomfortable. Many will project further, others will retreat. But either way, you remain anchored. Another powerful shift happens when you stop answering every question that comes with an edge. Not all questions are genuine requests for information. Some are disguised accusations. Some are traps. Some are attempts to corner you. You're not obligated to answer every question simply because it was asked. Choosing to pause, choosing to ask a question back, or choosing not to engage at all is a form of discernment, not avoidance. When you respond selectively instead of reflexively, people sense your boundaries. Boundaries don't always need to be stated. They can be felt. A calm, measured response signals that you are not easily pulled, and that signal carries far more authority than long explanations ever could. There's also something to be said about emotional economy. Defending yourself is expensive. It costs energy, focus, and emotional regulation. Over time, constantly defending drains you. It leaves you tired and resentful. Grounded communication conserves energy. It allows you to stay engaged without being consumed. It's sustainable. And sustainability is a hallmark of true strength. As you practice this way of communicating, you'll notice a deeper internal change. Your sense of self becomes less dependent on external feedback. You stop scanning conversations for approval. You stop measuring your worth based on how well you defended your position. You start feeling solid from the inside out. That internal alignment makes it much harder for others to destabilize you. What's interesting is that you don't have to announce this shift to anyone. You don't need to explain that you're no longer defending yourself. You don't need to justify your calm. The change speaks for itself. People either rise to meet you at that level or they fall away from relevance in your life. Both outcomes serve you. This kind of communication also restores a sense of dignity that many people don't realize they've lost. Dignity isn't about pride. It's about self-respect. It's about knowing when to speak and when not to. It's about understanding that not every challenge deserves engagement, and it's about trusting yourself enough to remain centered even when others are not. Eventually, the urge to defend quiets down. What once felt impossible becomes natural. You stop feeling pulled. You stop feeling the need to explain yourself into exhaustion. You begin to experience conversations as choices rather than battles. And that shift changes not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. This is where confidence stops being something you perform and starts being something you embody. You no longer need to prove strength because it's felt. You no longer need to argue for your worth because it's settled internally. And when your worth is settled, accusations lose their grip. As this steadiness becomes part of how you communicate, you begin to notice a fundamental shift in how you experience conflict itself. Conflict stops feeling like a personal threat and starts feeling like information. Instead of seeing someone's criticism as an attack on your identity, you begin to see it as data about them, their expectations, their emotional state, or their unmet needs. This reframing alone removes much of the sting. When conflict becomes information instead of danger, defensiveness loses its purpose. Defensiveness only exists when something inside you feels like it's being taken away, your reputation, your dignity, your safety, your sense of being understood. But once you're anchored internally, those things aren't so fragile anymore. You don't need to fight to protect them. They're stable. And when something is stable, it doesn't panic when pressure is applied. This is why truly confident people often seem unbothered by criticism. It's not that they're immune to it. It's that they don't experience it as a threat. They don't merge criticism with identity. Someone's words remain external instead of burrowing inward. That separation is everything. Without it, every conversation becomes a referendum on your value. With it, conversations become exchanges, not verdicts. Another important layer of this practice is learning how to let conversations end without resolution. This can be deeply uncomfortable for people who crave closure or fairness. We want things to make sense. We want misunderstandings to be cleared. We want people to admit when they're wrong. But not every conversation ends cleanly, and forcing closure often creates more damage than letting things be unfinished. When you stop defending yourself, you also stop chasing resolution from people who are unwilling or incapable of giving it. You recognize that resolution isn't always mutual. Sometimes resolution is internal. It's deciding that you don't need the other person to see things your way in order for you to move forward. That decision restores your energy faster than any argument ever could. There's a quiet strength in walking away mentally. Even if you stay physically present, you can listen without absorbing, you can hear without agreeing, you can remain polite without engaging emotionally. That ability protects your inner world while still allowing you to function in complex relationships. Over time, this practice sharpens your discernment. You become better at recognizing who is speaking in good faith and who isn't. Not everyone who questions you is attacking you. Some people genuinely want clarity. The difference becomes obvious when you stop reacting. Those who are sincere will soften, explain, and engage respectfully. Those who aren't will escalate, provoke, or repeat themselves. Groundedness exposes intention without confrontation. This awareness allows you to adjust your response accordingly. You don't use the same approach with everyone. You're not rigid. You're responsive. With healthy communicators, you clarify. With antagonistic ones, you conserve energy. With emotionally volatile people, you slow things down. This flexibility doesn't come from strategy alone. It comes from self-trust. Self-trust is built every time you pause and choose not to react. Every time you remain calm in a moment where you could have exploded. Every time you don't explain yourself when old habits urge you to. Each small moment compounds. And eventually, you no longer wonder how you should respond, You feel it in your body. That's when grounded communication becomes instinctive. You'll also notice that when you stop defending yourself, you stop attracting the same type of conflict. People test boundaries unconsciously. When they sense reactivity, they poke. When they sense stability, they hesitate. Not because you're intimidating, but because you're unclear territory. And unclear territory makes manipulation risky. This is especially important in dynamics where power is uneven, such as workplaces or family relationships. When you're lower on the hierarchy, defensiveness can feel like survival. But even there, calm framing, questions, and steady responses often shift the dynamic more than explanations ever could. Authority isn't just positional, it's energetic, and energy can't be faked for long. Something else happens as well. You begin to speak less, but with more impact. When you don't fill space defensively, your words carry more weight. People listen differently. Silence creates contrast. Concise statements land harder than paragraphs. And when you do choose to speak, it feels intentional rather than impulsive. This economy of language protects you from being misunderstood further. Over-explaining often invites misinterpretation. The more you say, the more material there is for others to twist. Clarity thrives in simplicity. Grounded communicators intuitively understand this. They don't flood conversations. They let meaning do the work. Letting meaning do the work requires patience, and patience is rare. Most people rush to be understood immediately. They can't tolerate being momentarily unseen. But patience is what allows you to stay aligned with yourself instead of bending to external pressure. It's the willingness to trust that your steadiness is enough even when there's no immediate payoff. One of the paradoxes of communication is that the less you chase understanding, the more likely it becomes. People sense desperation. They sense when you need them to get it. That urgency pushes them away. But when you speak calmly and step back, others often lean in. They feel safe. They feel less controlled, and ironically, they become more open to hearing you. This doesn't mean every interaction turns respectful. Some people double down when they lose control. They may escalate emotionally. They may insult. They may attempt to provoke guilt or shame. That's when staying grounded matters most. Their escalation isn't evidence that you're wrong. It's evidence that their strategy isn't working. Being able to recognize this in real time keeps you from taking the bait. You stop asking, "What should I say?" and start asking, "What's actually happening here?" That shift in perspective is liberating. It turns confusion into clarity. You stop personalizing behavior that was never about you to begin with. Eventually, you realize that defending yourself was never about truth. It was about fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing approval, fear of conflict. Once those fears loosen their grip, defense loses its urgency. You don't need it anymore. You don't rely on it. And because of that, it stops defining your interactions. Your nervous system also begins to calm down. Conversations that once spiked anxiety start to feel manageable. You recover faster. You don't replay every word afterward. You trust yourself to handle whatever comes next. That sense of internal safety is one of the greatest benefits of this work. And perhaps, most importantly, you start to respect yourself more. You see yourself choosing composure over chaos, clarity over reaction, presence over performance. That self-respect becomes visible. Others feel it, and once they feel it, the way they engage with you changes. As that self-respect deepens, you begin to understand something subtle but powerful. Not every challenge requires a response, and not every response requires words. There is an internal shift that happens when you stop measuring your worth by how well you defend yourself. You no longer feel the urge to correct every misunderstanding or clarify every misinterpretation. You realize that being misunderstood, while uncomfortable, is not fatal. In fact, sometimes it's inevitable. And more importantly, sometimes it's harmless. Most people believe that if they don't correct the record immediately, damage will be done. But often the opposite is true. The more you rush to correct, the more you entangle yourself in narratives that were never yours. When you remain steady, people are left alone with their assumptions. Some will revise them on their own. Others won't. But either way, you haven't lost yourself in the process, and that's the real win. There's a maturity that comes with letting people be wrong about you. Not because you don't care, but because you understand that perception is not something you can fully control. You can influence it, but you can't manage it. And exhausting yourself trying to manage it only fractures your sense of self. When you accept that, you stop performing for approval and start living from alignment. This is where presence replaces performance. You're no longer trying to sound right, look right, or come across a certain way. You're simply there, fully, honestly, calmly. That presence communicates more than any defense ever could. It tells people that you trust yourself enough to stand without a shield. And that kind of trust is magnetic. You also begin to notice how much silence reveals. When you stop filling every pause with explanation, you start hearing what's really being said. You notice patterns, repetition, emotional undertones. You hear insecurity disguised as accusation, fear disguised as control, confusion disguised as certainty. None of that was visible before because you were too busy defending to observe. Observation is power. When you observe instead of react, you gain clarity, and clarity leads to better decisions. You become selective about where you invest your energy. You stop arguing with people who have no intention of understanding. You stop chasing validation from environments that withhold it by design. You stop explaining yourself to people who already decided who you are before the conversation started. That selectivity brings peace. It also brings strength. You begin to recognize that your calm is not passive. It's deliberate. It's a choice you make over and over again. And each time you choose it, You reinforce the part of you that doesn't need external permission to exist confidently. This way of communicating also strengthens your internal boundaries. You become more aware of where you end and where others begin. Their emotions stop bleeding into your identity. Their disappointment stops sounding like failure. Their anger stops feeling like danger. You can be present with someone else's feelings without absorbing them. That emotional separation is a skill, and it changes everything. In moments where pressure is high, this skill becomes invaluable. When someone raises their voice, you don't match it. When someone becomes sarcastic, you don't mirror it. When someone tries to rush you, you slow down even more. That contrast is grounding not just for you, but often for the other person as well. Your steadiness becomes a reference point. And here's something important: staying grounded does not mean tolerating disrespect. Silence is powerful, but it's not submission. There are moments when boundaries need to be spoken clearly. The difference is that when you speak from groundedness instead of defensiveness, your boundaries land differently. They're clean. They're firm. They're not loaded with emotion. You might say something simple like, "I'm not okay with that tone," or "I'm not going to continue this conversation if it stays like this." No justification, no explanation, just a statement of reality. Those statements don't invite debate, they set a condition, and conditions are far more effective than arguments. What surprises many people is how often this approach diffuses situations faster than confrontation ever did. When there's no emotional fuel, the fire struggles to burn. People who are used to controlling conversations through intensity suddenly find themselves without leverage. Some will retreat. Others will try a different approach. Either way, you've shifted the dynamic. Over time, you start to feel less reactive, not just in conversations, but in life. Small frustrations don't spike the same way. Criticism doesn't linger as long. You recover quicker. You don't replay interactions endlessly in your mind. That mental space returns to you. And with it comes creativity, focus, and emotional availability. This is one of the most underestimated benefits of not defending yourself. You reclaim enormous amounts of mental energy. Energy that was once spent rehearsing arguments, crafting responses, and replaying conversations now becomes available for things that actually nourish you. You sleep better, you think clearer, you show up more fully where it matters. Eventually, you reach a point where defending yourself no longer feels instinctive. It feels unnecessary, almost foreign. When someone challenges you unfairly, there's a pause instead of a surge. You feel grounded instead of triggered. You're aware but not destabilized. That's not indifference. That's emotional sovereignty. And once you experience that sovereignty, you realize how much of your past communication was shaped by survival rather than choice. You see how often you were trying to earn safety instead of standing in it. That realization isn't shameful. It's freeing. Because now you know you have another option. This option doesn't make every conversation easy, it makes them honest. And honesty, while sometimes uncomfortable, is far more sustainable than constant defense. It allows you to show up as yourself without armor. And that authenticity becomes your most consistent source of confidence. As you continue to live this way, something quietly transformative begins to happen in your relationships. The people who relied on your defensiveness to feel powerful start to lose interest. The ones who thrived on provoking explanations, emotional reactions, or justifications find less traction with you. Conversations that once felt draining begin to shorten on their own. Not because you are avoiding people, but because there is no longer anything for them to pull from you. This is especially noticeable around narcissistic personalities. Narcissists depend on engagement that feeds their sense of control, your explanations, your emotional labor, your urgency to be understood. When you stop defending yourself, you disrupt that supply. Calm doesn't excite them. Boundaries frustrate them. Silence starves the dynamic they depend on. And while that may initially trigger more pressure, over time it exposes the imbalance in the relationship. You begin to see clearly that many arguments were never about truth or resolution. They were about dominance, about control, about keeping you emotionally invested in proving something. Once you stop playing that role, the entire structure weakens. You realize you were never losing because you were wrong. You were losing because you were participating in a rigged game. This clarity can feel unsettling at first. There may be moments of guilt, moments where you wonder if you're being cold, distant, or uncaring. That's conditioning speaking. You were taught that over-explaining equals kindness, that self-sacrifice equals love, that maintaining harmony at your own expense is maturity. But real maturity doesn't erase you from the equation. It includes you. What replaces defensiveness is discernment. You start choosing when to engage and when to disengage. You begin responding based on values instead of emotions. You ask yourself quiet questions internally. Is this worth my energy? Is this person capable of hearing me? Is responding here aligned with who I want to be? Those questions become your compass, and something else shifts internally. You stop needing immediate closure. Not every interaction has to end with agreement. Not every conversation needs resolution. Some things can remain open, ended without threatening your sense of self. You learn to walk away from conversations unfinished, unsatisfied, unresolved, and still at peace. That ability to leave without closure is powerful. It means your stability no longer depends on other people's understanding or validation. It means you trust yourself enough to carry your truth without needing it mirrored back to you. And that trust becomes the foundation of a deeper confidence, one that isn't shaken by accusation or misunderstanding. You also begin to trust your intuition more. Without the noise of constant defense, you can hear yourself again. You notice discomfort earlier. You recognize red flags faster. You no longer talk yourself out of your own perceptions just to keep the peace. That internal alignment protects you from manipulation in ways no argument ever could. When confrontation is unavoidable, you approach it differently. You're not trying to win. You're trying to remain grounded. You speak slower. You choose fewer words. You let your tone do the work your explanations used to do. And because you're not emotionally overinvested, your words land with more weight. There's a quiet authority in that. People sense it. They may not always like it, but they respect it. And those who don't were never respecting you in the first place. They were only responding to how much of yourself you were willing to give away. Over time, your nervous system recalibrates. You no longer live in a state of readiness to defend. Your body learns that disagreement is not danger. That criticism does not equal rejection. That silence does not mean loss. This regulation has ripple effects across your life. You feel safer, more centered, less reactive, more present. And presence is ultimately what changes everything. When you are present, you are not pulled into old patterns. You don't default to defense, explanation, or collapse. You stay with yourself. You hold your ground calmly. That presence is what people feel. It's what shifts dynamics without force. Eventually, you realize something profound. You were never meant to explain yourself into safety. Safety comes from self-trust, from boundaries, from the ability to remain calm under pressure, from knowing that you are allowed to exist without permission. Stopping defensiveness is not about becoming indifferent or emotionally closed. It's about becoming anchored. It's about choosing clarity over chaos, alignment over approval, dignity over drama. It's about leading yourself before trying to lead any conversation. And once you do that, everything changes, not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, quietly, from the inside out.